Chapter 10. Economic growth, financial system, business cycles. Lots of stuff in this chapter, like lots of stuff. Economic growth. What do we mean by economic growth? Years and years ago, this wasn't such a big deal. We were more worried about recessions. But over the last 20 or 30 years, when we've had the one really bad recession and then the coronavirus thing, which isn't a typical recession, but other than that, the economy has just grown. We've been more interested in economic growth issues. So economic growth is about real GDP, right? We're going to separate economic growth into two different categories. One is the short run. What happens, over 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and the economy goes into recession, comes out of recession, grows for a few years. That would be short run economic growth. Long run economic growth is what happens to us over 20 years, 40 years, 70 years. Yes, exciting. We measure economic growth by looking at real GDP per capita. Okay, we looked at real GDP per capita by countries a while ago, and I think we noted when we did that, for example, that in 1900, Argentina and the U.S. had the same real GDP per capita, and now the U.S. has 4 times the real GDP per capita. Remember, real GDP per capita is output per person. That's how much we're producing per person in our country. So the more you produce, then the more goods and services you have available for the people who live in your country. And again, it's per person. So China has this huge GDP, by normal measures, second in the world to the United States. But per person, their real GDP is a sixth of the real GDP per capita in the United States. Okay, this is the United States over time. You'll notice again that this is adjusted for inflation. We were about $8,000 a person in 1900, and we're close to, this is 2012, but we know from what we did before that we're well over 60,000 now. That means that we're producing 8 times as much stuff per person today as we did in 1900. Half of the people in the United States lived below the poverty line in 1900. Now, maybe 1 in 7 people in the United States lives below the poverty line, 1 in 8. Okay? So we have a lot more stuff per person, a lot. And we boomed. Yes? It was a nice boom. Okay, this real GDP per person has to do with our standard of living. What happens to your country? What are you capable of doing as your income rises this way, as you have more real GDP per person? It means you have more stuff. It means you have more options about what you're going to produce. So once your real GDP is booming, you're producing all the food you can use. Now you have resources that you can use for other things. So your education system should get better. Your healthcare system should get better. All of these things should get better. Your life expectancy should go up. Now, life expectancy correlates some with real GDP. But we should note that life expectancy in Japan is higher than it is in the United States. Life expectancy in Western Europe, all those countries, they have longer life expectancies than we do in the United States. Okay? We have infant mortality. The chance that a baby's born and doesn't make it to, through his first 3 months. The United States has infant mortality rate that's multiple times higher than the infant mortality rates in Western Europe and Japan. We have a very high infant mortality rate for being a developed country that we are. All right? There's reasons for that. The biggest reason probably is the countries that have these really low infant mortality rates. The government makes sure that everybody gets health care, where in the United States, many women through their pregnancy aren't getting health care. They're not getting to visit with their doctor. Okay. lots of other services become available. So, again, education system's better. You get colleges and universities. You get things like child care services and other things that become available in your society that aren't available in other societies. And we talked about this before, that GDP does not mean we're happier, right? Just because our GDP is higher than the GDP in England doesn't mean we're happier than the people in England. We probably are, because they have to live in England. But, does having stuff make you happy? And I'm not trying to be a Buddhist here and tell you you should abandon stuff, and stuff doesn't make you happy. Clearly it's better to have more stuff than, Somalia stuff. But you just can't necessarily correlate being happy with having a lot of stuff. Okay. Ooh, magic. We haven't done magic yet. We're about to do magic. We want to talk about growth and doing a simple way to talk about how long it takes for things to happen and how fast you're growing and what that means. And the answer to the simplest way to do these things is what we call the magic number of 70. Now, the magic number is not actually 70. Let me be clear about that. The magic number is 100 times the natural log of 2, for those of you who are mathematically inclined. So it's actually a little smaller than 70, but we round it up to 70. Some people round it up to 72 just to make math easier, but 70. So let's talk about compounding. Let's say you have $1,000 and you put it into some miracle investment that grows at 10% a year. Well, at the end of the first year, how much do you have? Well, 1,000 times 1.1 is 1,100. If you have $1,000 and it grows by 10%, you've got 1,100. The next year, you're not going to get just 100. The next year, the original 1,000 is going to grow by 10%, but the 100 you got is going to grow by 10% too. This is called compounding. So the next year, 1,100 times 1.1 is 1,210. The first year I went up by 100. The second year I went up by 110. The third year I'm going to go up by still more. Every year that 10% gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So it doesn't take me 10 years to turn that 1,000 into 2,000 at 10% a year. Okay? If I have $1,000 and I'm earning 10% a year, turns out it's only going to take me 7 years to turn that 1,000 into 2,000 because my growth compounds. Okay? Just try the double every year thing, right? My city has 10,000 people. If it doubles every year, it starts out at 10,000 people. The next year it's got 20,000. The next year it's got 40,000. Right? So it grew by 10,000 the first year, 20,000 the second year. Right? It's going to grow by 40,000 the next year. It keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We got that? All right. So what's the magic number of 70? It's simple. What growth rate in my real GDP per capita do I need to double it in 10 years? So I want to double my money in 10 years. What growth rate do I need? What interest rate do I need if I'm putting money in the bank and I want it to double? If I want my country to double in 10 years, what growth do I need? The answer is I take that 70, I divide it by the 10 years, and that tells me I need 7%. Okay? Is that simple? Hopefully that's so simple you can't believe it. Yes? And we can do it the other way. How many years should be will it take to double my real GDP per capita if I'm growing at 2%? So the United States, for the last 10 years, has been averaging about 2% growth, right? There's occasionally a little bit faster. Obama once hit around 5. Trump's best is, around 4. But Trump's last quarter before the coronavirus stuff hit was 1.6. So we've been averaging around 2. If your economy is growing at 2% a year, it takes you 35 years to double. Okay? If you go back, let's go backwards. Let's go backwards to here. So this is 8 times. So it doubled 4, right? It went 2 and then 4 and then 8. So on average, it doubled about every 35 years. Yeah? So on average through there, we grew at about 2%. But if you notice, we spent a long time not growing, and then we got a little better. So we probably averaged closer to 4% during that growth period. And now we're at 2. China, you know who China is. China's growing at 4, which means, or 6 in fact, a lot of years 6. So China's going to double in size about every 10 years, and we're doubling in size about every 35 years. If we were to keep that up, it won't be very long, just a few decades, until they catch up with us. And if you think about Japan and you think about Korea, in 50 years they went from being 2 of the poorest countries on earth to being, 2/3 of the 3/4 of the GDP per capita in the United States. So a faster growth rate lets you catch up, and it doesn't really take that long if you have the right growth rate. Okay? So the question is, what creates this long-run economic growth? We're only going to talk about that really quickly now, and then in the next chapter, we're going to have a whole chapter about it. The answer is that long-run economic growth correlates with increases in labor productivity. We make our labor more effective, and the more effective our labor becomes, we grow. Now, how do we do that? Let's suppose that we have 3 people, and each of these 3 people, their job is to dig irrigation trenches for farmers. We give one of these people a spoon, one of these people a shovel, and one of these people the backhoe. And these people get paid per ditch they dig. Who's going to make the most money? Well, hopefully you think the person with the backhoe is going to dig more ditches than the person with the shovel, who's going to dig a lot more ditches than the person with the spoon. Okay? What do we call these man-made things that we use to help us work? We call them capital. So that spoon would be capital, the shovel is capital, the backhoe is capital. Okay? The key to this is we have to mix together capital and labor. The better a job we do of giving our workers the right capital, the more productive they will be. And we include in that what we call human capital, which is their skills and training and education and experience and all of that. The better we give our workers capital, the better we mix our capital stock with workers, the more efficient those workers will be, the more money they'll make, the more stuff we produce. Okay? Now, if I can give some worker a laser cannon, the worker with the laser cannon is probably going to do a better job than the guy with the backhoe. And if not, they can always blow up the backhoe with the laser cannon. As we get new technologies, those new technologies are also going to improve our ability to grow. Okay? So, long-run growth is about the capital to labor ratio. And your book talks about the capital per hour worked, which is a more specific version of just saying capital labor ratio. How much capital do we have per worker? All right? And it's hard to talk about worker in some sense because some workers work 5 hours a week and some workers work 60 hours a week, and so it's easier from a thought standpoint to think about capital per hour that we work, but capital labor ratio. Okay, how much capital do we have per worker? Changing technology is going to make us more efficient too. We'll have better capital to mix with our workers, right? A computer's better than a typewriter, if you even know what a typewriter is. Okay? And it's also helpful for the government to make policy that's supportive of growth. So we already talked about Costa Rica and the fact that one of the reasons that they're booming is their government really pushed education, and education geared toward getting high technology industries into Costa Rica. So having a government that understands what they need to do and does things to support that growth is really important. All right, we have a concept called potential GDP. Potential GDP is how much we could make if every business was operating at capacity. So when a recession is on, we're not anywhere near our potential. The businesses aren't working anywhere near capacity. People aren't working. We have a big gap between GDP and potential GDP. When the economy is booming, then GDP and potential GDP come close together. If we can increase technology, we can, or increase our labor force or add more capital, we can increase potential GDP, which means we can increase our economic potential. Okay? So again, potential GDP, the difference between potential GDP and GDP tells us how much room we have to grow. If we can't increase our potential GDP, then we can't grow. We can only keep going the way we're going.